everyone. Welcome back. We're super happy that so many of you stayed. I kind of feel like also it's a benefit for us with the rain, like you don't want to go out into the rain right now. So anyway, really happy to see you all. Welcome to the keynote, Green Makes the City Sound by our second network artist in residence, the Floating Museum. We would collectively like to send our sincere gratitude to the conference organizers and also our deep solidarity to the protesters out in front of the university. Everyone's still marching in the streets, and of course, most of all, the people of Palestine. May this suffering end soon. My name is Nanna and I work as a curator at Malmö Art Museum. I had the joy of being part of shaping the museum-wide network from the very initial thought that craved for us to have some of these talks about institutional change collectively, as well as inviting non-institutional practitioners into the conversation also. So, it's a huge pleasure to welcome my colleagues and friends, Avery R. Young and Andrew Shackman, back to Copenhagen, as well as Foghmar and Jeremiah, Hospice Bufford, joining us through Zoom from Chicago. Will you give it up? Do you want to say a quick hi?
Hi everyone, excited to be here, not be here at the same time.
You are the four founding members of the Art Collective Floating Museum, and your common practice is centered in creating new models that explore relationships between art, community, architecture, and public institutions. You often work with site-responsive art, design and programming, and through this you bring awareness to the potential in these relationships, considering the infrastructure, history, and aesthetics of spaces. Through the years we've been working together, I've always been thinking that for me, your practice is about this idea of making visible. I remember the first time we met in Chicago doing Expo, where you had a massive inflatable sculpture or monument exhibited out in the entrance by Navy Pier. The sculpture portrayed 4 busts based on items from the collections of the Disable Museum of African American History, the Field Museum of Natural History, as well as other interpretations of historical figures. These busts reference Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, Chicago's first non-indigenous settler, Kitahawah, DuSable's wife from the Potawatomi tribe, as well as Harold Washington, the first African-American mayor of Chicago, and a bust of a young boy by artist William Artis. The Founders, which the sculpture is called, has been popping up in community sites throughout Chicago. The work is part of a series that highlights historical figures and gives space to stories of indigenous people, people of color, and by this honoring the often overlooked roles they have had in shaping our world. You work with these collections, your original juxtaposing, but most importantly, your intention to make these hidden narratives visible in public space is an important act in reshaping a fair and plural history, as well as introducing the idea of there being several perspectives on what has happened throughout times. At a collective meeting with the network partners during your residency, we had a talk about change and how change is created. Andrew, you asked us about the tensions that prevent change in our contexts. Exactly where do these tensions lie? We ended up talking about the delicate issue of power, and more precisely the tension that lies in sharing power and giving agency to others within the institutional. Because could that possibly unpack a radical change in everything we know, a change in the exact thing, the knowledge that gives power to these institutions in the first place? How can we, as institutions, stay open to including different shapes of knowledge into our knowledge systems, like the embodied knowledge found in the interpersonal and in communities? And how can we be more curious about where knowledge lives outside of the art world and outside of the academic, and by this also learn new methods of how knowledge can be shared? When we talk about change, we often forget to talk about the conditions which fosters change and the mechanisms we need to be able to regenerate. But our self-awareness is for sure a critical tool when we seek to make significant and lasting change. So I hope everyone will remain open to where the tensions lie in your own contexts. I feel quite positive that everything we will pick up now will save us a lot of trouble later. Andrew, Avery, Fahim, Jeremiah, I think what aligns for our work is an eagerness to challenge the established by breaking down gates, formats, and languages. So let's start by doing that already now, by renaming this keynote as a collective space for dreaming. I think that makes the framing a bit more right for us. I'm passing the word on to you now.
Thank you, Ann. Hey, everybody, what's good? When I say museum, you say why? That's funny to me. So, I am one of the folks over here at the, where am I from? The Floating Museum. So many things. But one of the things that we all have in common outside of being artists, we all are educators. They teach art and design and architecture and things of that nature. I teach poetry and theater. And what I usually like to do, first day in the classroom, is make people think we're not in the classroom, that we're on a stage. So guess what? Y'all are not in the lecture hall. You all about to be on stage, all right? This is the stage. I'm the audience. We're gonna have some fun. So if you're sitting with like a laptop in front of you for like just a couple of minutes, you're gonna put the laptop to the side. You're gonna sit it on the seat. Cause you're gonna need the space. Okay? Alright, so look, gonna do this. I'm gonna give you a number and I'm gonna give you like a thing to do in that number. When you hear that number, you just do that thing. Is that cool? Cool? All right. So when I say one, I need everybody to sit like a perfect student. One. Let me see. I'm looking for perfect students. I'm looking for this one right here. Perfect student. Make it like this one. Make it like this one right there. All right. When I say two, not so perfect. Two. Cool. Let me see one. Let me see two. All right, now when I say three, I need everybody just to stand up and face the board. Three. Here we go. All right.
Can you be
Perfect. One. Two. Three. I heard a question. Can you be a who? All right. When I say four, you take your right fist and you put it into your left palm like this. All right, four. Everybody do it at the same time. Four. Four. All right, dear Mark. When I say five, you take your right palm, left palm like this. Five. Four. Five, four, five, four, hey, five. All right, here we go. Then, when I say six, you turn to the left and you stomp your right foot. Okay? Here we go. 4, 5, 6. Woo-hoo! All right, everybody sit back down, give me one. You all doing really, really, really good. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now when I say 7, you just turn to your left and you down your face to the back wall. 7. All right, so you just learned a choreo, and then we're going to add a poem to it. And then we're going to call it a choreo poem. And when I say 8, everybody should move both their arms up slowly like this. All right, so 8. Let me see. Slow rise, slow rise. All right, everybody sit back down. Let me see one. 2, 3, 4, 5. Stop. Let's work on that 4. 4, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, all right, you sit back down. That was the choreo. Now we're gonna get to the poem. The poem is titled "We Real Cool." Repeat, "We Real Cool." We Real Cool. This poem was written by Gwendolyn Brooks. Say Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks, for those who may not know, a very, 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 very famous Pulitzer Prize winning poet, first poet laureate of the state of Illinois. Just no big deal. Just Gwendolyn Brooks. Anyway, one day, Gwendolyn Brooks was walking in the community, and she walked past this pool hall, and she saw about 7 school-aged children, probably somewhere like in the 9th, 10th grade, but she knew they was like supposed to be in school. They were in the pool hall, and she wrote this poem. She wrote this poem that goes, "We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we dance in, we jazz June, we die soon." That's the poem, right? So now we got the moves. I'll do the poem. I'll say one line, and when I say the first line, you're gonna do what move? Which one? When I say the second line, you're gonna do what move? Yep. When I say the third line, you're gonna do what move? There you go. Come on now. Come on, dear Lord! All right, so here we go. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We dance in. We jazz June. We die soon. Give yourselves a round of applause. You see that? You see that, Marlene? You see that, Jeremiah? You see how they did that? You see how they did that? Look. So, do this with.
We can hear them though. We can hear.
Oh, you did. They did it perfectly. They did it perfectly. So, we do this while going to schools, and we do this with students who may have written together, may not have written together, may have acted together, may not have acted together. The whole point of it is now with this journey, we do it together. This is no longer desks and chairs. These are platforms where our imagination. And we all dream, and we all support each other's dreams. And this is the work that we do here at the Photo Museum in Chi-Town, Illinois. And that's what we're gonna talk about. We good? You cool? You're not cool. You're real cool. Shaq.
Yes.
Holla.
Okay. Thank you for having us. We are 2 of many members, so I think we speak with many voices. Today will be our voice, but Fahim and Jeremiah are also online to assert their voice, so I will be kind of like a timekeeper, organizer of ideas, but we can be sometimes chaotic because we are many voices. We are a real collective, and we don't always agree, but we agree on a few things. One of the things about Gwendolyn Brooks, Avery came to my class at the University of Chicago recently and mentioned that someone like Langston Hughes, in his poetry, was testifying to the existence of people, but Gwendolyn Brooks was writing about the nuances of that existence, not trying to prove that people existed, but skipping past that and writing directly to it. And the title of this lecture, Dream Makes a Giddy Sound, is from a poem called Kitchenette Building. And if you look at the structure of the poem, there's a question in the middle about, could a dream send up through onion fumes? And then it ends, anticipate a message, let it begin. But it begins with a kind of institutional question. The dream is competing with things like rent, feeding somebody, satisfying a man, which is a kind of cultural construct. And it ends with waiting for lukewarm water, waiting for somebody to get out of the tub in this architecture that would have been where a lot of people lived in Bronzeville. I will confess, we're called Floating Museum. We are I don't know if people know this, but 501c3 in the United States is an IRS, Internal Revenue Service exempt organization, is a framework. We created that framework as artists in order to get insurance and to work with a lawyer and to negotiate with the city. It started out a little bit as a kind of format in order to get something done, which was to float a barge down a river. It has taken on, this is our 9th year, which is actually mind-boggling that it seems like yesterday that we started. And we've grown considerably. So now, it started with Avery, me, Fahim, and Jeremiah, so poet laureate of the city of Chicago at the moment. My background is in urban design and architecture, but I also practice as an artist. And I'll introduce Fahim and Jeremiah for the sake of expediency. Fahim was the director of the Southside Community Arts Center and also an artist and sculptor, and Jeremiah is also an artist and sculptor. All of us teach at different universities, and we all had established careers when we met. So it wasn't like a band that we formed to try to, get a reputation. It was mostly that within each of our practices, there was something kind of missing within the calcified structures of operating in the world as creatives and artists. Since then, we've expanded. So now we have people who also, we have a director of operations, Gail, who also has experience with the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago, working on publications and exhibitions. Leilani Douglas is our director of development, but also is a researcher at all kinds of different topics. So we have multiple lives and multiple practices, and we come together to fill a need. We've grown quickly, and we're facing, I would say, a moment of questioning. We are becoming responsible for the institution we created. So maybe in relationship to the things that you've been asking, we're asking that too. How do we be responsible? Maybe practice being adults, because this conceit let us not quite be adults for a while, and let us get things done. But now as we form an institution, how do we do that without sacrificing the things we really came together for? And it's a really difficult question. And there are a lot of tensions to your my question to you was actually hoping to get some answers. But the confession is today, we came through the airport on the way here. I think we're flying 3 days and we're here a day and a half. Maybe not good for our carbon footprint. But we walked right through and no one asked us to declare anything. In the United States, you couldn't do that. They would ask you if you have anything to declare. I don't think we have anything to declare other than we have a lot of questions right now. And so what we'll do is take you through what we've done, some inspiration, which frames our concerns about how we're thinking about an institution, and some kind of projective ideas. We were talking last night about this poem, and we were asking ourselves, who are we in the structure of this poem? Are we Gwendolyn Brooks, the poet? Are we the dream? Are we the pleasure of warm water? Or are we something else? We've been drifting for a while. So we are kind of an adjacent institution. We will plug into museums. We'll plug into public infrastructure like park spaces. We'll plug into public schools. We'll drive trucks around the city, and I'll show you some of those things. We're kind of in a space between a lot of other things as a kind of connective tissue that seems to satisfy a lot of people's needs. And we've discovered, sometimes the director of a museum is also a poet at night. Sometimes the director of planning and development for the city of Chicago, also has a jewelry practice. So people have multiple lives. They're not just what their job or card describes them as. And because of that, there's been a lot of empathy for plugging in at various scales. Okay, so far we've been, I'll take you through a series of projects. These classified in kind of two categories: collections activations and infrastructure activations. I think we do other things besides that, but I think these are, I don't know, maybe the primary things. And they're very complicated projects, and we'll get into the complications of that. So some examples. This is in 1968, there was a monument in the city of Chicago. If you've watched Chicago 7 with whoever Borat is, there's a scene in there of this conflict. The photograph you see on the left is very strange for Chicago because Chicago is a glacial landscape and is flat. So it's really strange that there's this hill. It's a very mysterious photo to begin with. And it's from Peter Bullock, who took this picture during the 1968 Democratic National Convention when a student tried to fly a Viet Cong flag on what was a Civil War monument and recontextualize a Civil War monument into something now that we associate with Vietnam and protesting Vietnam. 50 years to the day, we made another photograph, exactly around the same time. So what we did was excise all of those people represented in the photograph and created pickets and organized a performance with a dance company called Move Me Soul and a musician, basically to distract people so they wouldn't look directly into the camera. You know, we didn't want people macking for the camera. That became a performance and then becomes an installation in the middle of COVID when the Museum of Contemporary Art was totally empty. We kind of filled it with a crowd, a simulated crowd. We originally wanted to have a radio tower, but their budget was too narrow. So it's a photograph that turns into a series of other things. We got started, this is in the Park District. Chicago has 600 plus parks and 430 something field houses. I don't know of a city that has an infrastructure network quite as expansive. It is also where children go after school for other kinds of forms of education. It's where, when there was a hurricane in Puerto Rico, people were housed and received resources. It is a safety net within the city of Chicago, and it also contains museums, train sets. It's like it's polyphonic. We work with a museum there, the Southside Historical Society, and basically brought their collection into the public realm with docents to talk to the general public about Southside history. We've worked in the basement of the DeSalvo Museum of African American History and made a kind of ad hoc vitrine for people to, well, one of the issues with the DeSalvo Museum is it formed, and we will talk about that a little later, there were collections objects that were gathered from African Americans in Chicago because there was no archive for African American contributions to culture. So Margaret Burroughs was a school teacher and invited people to drop things off. They dropped things off like a Mr. T lunchbox, the first Black Barbie, a Charles White painting, some having $1 million commodity value, and some just having extremely charged cultural value, and other things having no provenance or record of where they came from whatsoever. So part of the exhibition was to invite collective memory, to try to identify some objects, and we used a vitrine that people could activate and then also identify things that might not have a record, so that the museum could know what's the entire history of its collection. About the same time, Palais de Tokyo came to Chicago to activate the Park District across the street from the original DeSalvo Museum, and we kind of made an exhibition with a museum within the museum dedicated to the DeSalvo's collection and to the architecture of the park. As Anne mentioned, we've also worked with the DeSalvo Museum, the Field Museum. If you don't know the story of DeSalvo and Kitahawah, which you wouldn't, and most Chicagoans don't until recently, DuSable was a fur trader who came from Haiti up through Louisiana, up the river to start a fur trapping business. In order to get permission to do that, married Kitihawa, who was a Potawatomi indigenous from the indigenous tribe there, and got the right to fur trade. Without that fur trade, there wouldn't have been what we would know as Fort Dearborn, which preceded the incorporation of the city of Chicago. So in a way, the city of Chicago is founded on the kind of love between these two people. And that's one sense of why it's called founders. The other sense is this second definition of the word, which is kind of about being a fault line or error. To founder has a kind of unstable definition. Combined with that is DuSable is represented by the president of the DuSable Heritage Association, and Kitihawa is represented, we scanned them and blew them up to 40 feet tall by an artist named Monica Rickard-Bolter, who is Potawatomi and agreed to participate and has been in some of our shows. I mean, it's funny when she walks into a park and sees her head 40 feet tall. And this is now drifting around the city of Chicago as a kind of ephemeral monument. One of the things in Chicago, space and occupying space is a very sensitive issue. So the idea of ephemeral monuments, not ones that take space permanently, but that can drift temporarily, is not threatening to a lot of people. And we're able to also deploy it for free to organizations who want attention for something else. Or institutions who are trying to, I don't know, like Expo, Chicago Expo will pay us. So we kind of work the system kind of like Robin Hood, taking funds and then distributing for free elsewhere. These kinds of things, it was sized originally so you could see it from the train. Chicago, if you've been there, has a train that's elevated, and its eyes were meant to look into the car. So that if you were just going to work one day, you would encounter something, sort of like a Fluxus intervention. You would encounter something strange that would take you out of the space of your day. So that's partly how these things became so tall. But, you know, it packs up to 1 meter cubed. So it's very deployable. Now we have a series. So we've received some grants to develop this. So we're on our third. I'm going to show you our second one. This was with the Chicago Botanical Society, looking at a florilegium, which is a documentation of colonial plants that would have been extracted into the world system, so things like coca, ginger, salt, maybe not salt, that's not a plant. I have a little jet lag. Poppy, and things that you would have received through a world system, but are not indigenous to the country. It's all about extraction and colonization. And then it gets installed in civic spaces. So this is a performance on Divan, which is nicknamed Little India. But it becomes the backdrop for performances, it becomes a spectacle for gathering, it marks space temporarily, and then we can pack it up and deliver it elsewhere. Right now it's behind a bunch of people who are speaking at the Illinois Humanities Festival like major public figures. It sits in the background.
Yeah.
Questlove, yeah. We're working on our third inflatable, which will be connected to Avery's practice. It's both a monument to the urban renewal, the buildings that were destroyed by urban renewal in the city of Chicago in Bronzeville. One of those buildings, the Mecca Flats, was a place where Louis Armstrong slept, where a lot of jazz was invented, but then was raised by Mies van der Rohe for Crown Hall, like his temple to architecture. By IIT. And then it's combined with, sorry, I just have to move that thing so I can read. And then with the Poetry Foundation and the Chicago Public School System, it becomes also a housing for the Center for Black Verse. So we can drift, it'll have an interior, why is it not? It'll have an interior. This is the first inflatable with an interior. So in a way, it's like a drifting architecture that can pop up at public schools, become the wee real cool medium for public performance, but also signify collections objects from this photographer named Richard Nickel. Richard Nickel documented a lot of buildings as they were being destroyed. A lot of people think about that as documenting these things as almost valuable objects, but what his focus was about craftspeople and their handiwork, which is very varied, almost like Sharp Cathedral in Chicago, supporting Adler and Sullivan architecture. But that buildings are these kind of collective effort indexes. They're community indexes. They're not just objects that we think of as historically important. They're ways people collaborate and improvise. And then the second category is infrastructure activations. So we've activated the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority, and we kind of work within the rules of the system, which can be pretty constraining. They are an institution, and they have concerns about public safety, about people not paying. You have to, and they're very slow-moving and lethargic institution in the city of Chicago. We worked with their already established advertising system. We had to pay for everything. We got nothing, no freebies with the CTA. And this train was, we made a wrap. When the mayor changed, they presented this project as one of the most exciting things they did the previous year, but we got almost no funding from it, just a lot of slow, bureaucratic processes that we had to go through. This train was only supposed to run for 6 months, and that was in 2017. I have seen it still in the system going around. So we're like kind of permanent fixture in the infrastructure network. One of the images is of DuSable, and one of the images is of Kitahawa. One of the complications of that is there were no photographs when DuSable and Kitahawa were alive, so these are imaginations of what they might have looked like, and there are a lot of depictions of them. Kitahawa was never imagined, but now that it's been imagined, it's become, you hear conversations about it in the public consciousness, and people have a living memory now, or not a living memory, they have a memory of someone who was alive that they might not have been aware of before. So people are starting to associate DuSable and Kitahawa with this love story of the founding of Chicago. So one of the benefits of having a performer and connected to the music industry is we had all these kind of surprise performances on the L, kind of, I guess, sort of Fluxus-inspired detournements of the day. At the concert, on the way to the concert. Here you see Megan McNeil with her baby swaddled, singing a house song. Megan McNeil was on the show The Voice. I don't know if any of you have watched The Voice here in Denmark. It's like, America's Got Talent or Eurovision or something. Yeah. And her production company is in the UK. So when this went viral, it blew up, like 2 million hits in an afternoon. It was insane. It wasn't really by our design. It's just because of Megan has a network, and that network ends up becoming part of the equation. That's what happens when you do collective work.
Right. Went viral, but we had to pay for her to get on the L that day.
Right. Right. We had a $2.50 ticket we had to pay for it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, they were like, you gotta pay to get on the L, yeah.
In Chicago, the river is not a clean place that you would swim, but it is connective tissue that connects a lot of constituencies along its infrastructure path. It was used mostly to deliver rubble or sand or concrete to construction sites, like when the Apple Store goes in, you hire a barge to deliver raw material. But the river, Rahm Emanuel, the mayor, had worked for a long time to convert actually it was a project that was, I, as an architect, received it in an office 20 years ago, and it was finally realized under the Emanuel administration, but made a bunch of civic spaces, but had no programming for it. So we were thinking about how we could activate the river, not as an industrial site, but as a new cultural space, using an industrial logic, which also was a negotiation because the city imagined this with Venetian gondolas and, you know, people with striped shirts and nice hats. I don't know. It doesn't feel anything like Venice. It is the city of big shoulders. It is a big shoulders river with a lot of conflict and tour boats and all kinds of things on it. But we drifted from the south side using a kind of museology technique of creating art with a shipping company to pack art, and then basically it spilled out on the shores when we would park. And then it became a stage for public performance with the person to my right now in the picture there, with band. But you know, we would park and it would become a platform for all kinds of people to plug into. And then with Kirsa and An, and some of you maybe in the room, during COVID, we had been planning exhibitions here, but we flew an inflatable, which is in the back, and we're taking home with us. But then we collaborated with artists in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, sent us videos. So we used the kind of infrastructure of advertising and followed this truck around. But if the video, say, was about poisoning water, we would find a spot in Chicago, Bubbly Creek, for example. It bubbles because unnaturally, it's not naturally effervescent. It is because of industrial damage. So we would park it there and take shots and videos to juxtapose common concerns projected across different places. And you know, COVID required it, but it became a sort of opportunity to improvise. And this is kind of the routes. So we're kind of using the roads, using public infrastructure, using an apparatus of advertisement and deterring it for some other set of commentaries. Because of our public infrastructure work and because of our collections activation work, we were asked if we wanted to curate the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And it is a kind of infrastructure. It's the 5th round of it. It was the one that just closed, our version in February, which is also, you know, we needed like a month of rest after this. It's kind of, I don't know if anyone's curated a big biennial, but it takes all of your body and mind and time and energy. Yeah, it's quite an effort. But the biennial's every 2 years, and often it closes with a catalog, and it's kind of dedicated to discourse. But we really were thinking about how to use it to make urbanistic change as a kind of feedback loop for the city of Chicago to think about its own development. So we engaged that. Someone was mentioning in a previous panel, people will ask an artist what they want to do. They can do anything, and they invite them to go into the forest, but they say, no, you need to be in the museum. So there's like a kind of quiet constraint. It was similar for this, because our practice is out in the field, but we also had to curate exhibitions in the cultural center. We activated this building at the bottom left is the Thompson Center. It was the state of Illinois' building. It's where you got your driver's license, where the judge advocate is, where law is processed. The state's attorney is there. And it's turning into Google's headquarters. So it was a chance, this kind of discrete moment, to take humongous public infrastructure and turn it over for an exhibition. Ibrahim Mahama sent us some tapestries, and we kind of covered the inside and had a lot of installations in what was a formerly civic administrative building. And on the bottom right, we were speculating on what monuments are and invited artists to reconceive monuments and think about a park, new kind of public park for the city in an interior in an exhibition hall. So even when we were required to be in the interior, we were pointing to City of Chicago sites. As we think about what we're going to do next, we have a couple, concerns about what it means to make an institution, and we don't want to be calcified. So Fahim worked for the Southside Community Art Center, which was founded by Margaret Burroughs. She's an inspiration. She was a public school teacher, as I mentioned. This house on the right, it was a place where art was collected. So she first collected a record of African American contributions to cultural history in her kitchen, and then her living room, and then ultimately the DuSable Museum, which was a police station, was turned back into a public park building and then was bequeathed to the DuSable Museum, which was founded and named after the founder at the time, without Kintahawa. It's a kind of drifting collection with a very wildly confusing provenance of what's in it, but everything is of value, just not commodity art value. She also founded the building across the street, which is the Southside Community Arts Center, and it's very important. It's a community art center, and we'll get into that next, but it's about aid at the same time that it's about art. It's about nourishment of a community at the same time that it's about exhibitions. So one of our inspirations, and if you know the United States and you understand how the slave trade worked and where people landed, and then after emancipation in the United States, how people moved northward for jobs, and a lot of that creating the jazz that you know today. There were these organizations because black people could not get insurance or bank accounts. They're social aid and pleasure clubs. That combination, social aid and pleasure, is really interesting. And it's really important. So this is from, there's hundreds of these they put on the parades in New Orleans. But people would pay a small amount, but they would get health care, and they would get a funeral upon their death. That funeral is where Second Line and jazz kind of emerges out of. It's important to understand the city context. So to the left would be where Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton and other people lived. It's called Storyville. It was kind of the red light district. And you can see all the way to the right, Congo Square, which is where people who were abducted and brought to the United States. There were 27 different languages, but there was a kind of musical affiliation that let people kind of communicate with each other there. In the early 20th century, the performances there were shut down. They were forbidden. And now what was Storyville is parking lots, and it's been, urban renewal has taken over. But it's really important to see that there are cemeteries.
And every Sunday, people are playing still at Congo Square.
And it's now Louis Armstrong Park.
And it also houses the Mahalia Jackson Opera House.
I'm going to show you two videos. They are what a social aid and pleasure club or beneficial society would do for a funeral. There are two parts. The first part is when the casket comes out of the church after the ceremony. It's coordinated by a marshal. It's not in the video, but there'll be a drum with snare off to establish the rhythm of a dirge. And then the second video releases into the city, also with a drum but with the snare on, establishes a beat, an up-tempo beat, and then releases that energy into the city, which becomes a kind of joyful event. So they're about like a minute. This is Dr. John's funeral. I'm a little jet lagged and I well up and I almost cry every time I play that, so I'm even more emotional right now with a little less sleep. I think what's really important about this, or inspiring, it's not just healthcare and financial aid for funerals, but there's pleasure attached to it. And because of that, people are glad to give their 25 cents to this insurance company. And that insurance company then funds that event, and it's a cycle of constant rejuvenation and nourishment and care for people. And it's an institution because it's a ratified in law, but it's also serving individuals. And this is something I think maybe we talk about a lot, like the intersection between interpersonal and systemic and structural things. I think a lot of the conversations today are about how we navigate those two things in relationship to each other. It's important because some of the rhythms there come from Africa, and on the way Brazil are in the South for 300 years, and then after emancipation migrate, and it is part of the ethos of the city of Chicago because we're a city that received two waves in World War I and World War II of people coming from the South. So it figures into our experience of what Chicago feels like. In Chicago, when people moved, then there was systemic legal racism, restrictive covenants about where people could live. So that figure on the left is what you would call Bronzeville. It's a compression based on the law of where people were allowed to rent, not own apartments. As an act of resistance around this, as opposed to social aid and benefit pleasure clubs, there was what is known as policy. It's kind of a euphemism for gambling. It is also a way of navigating around the system. But unlike the gambling you might know, it funds clubs and the first African-American owned bank, which also funded mortgages. So it's also like this system. Art is part of the pleasure system that keeps people engaged in policy, and the policy racket also funded people like Studs Terkel and Langston Hughes. It allowed people to have cash to not have to work a porter job in order to be an artist. So it was a way of supporting artistic life. And it's inspiring to us. It's not all of our history, but it's important historically. I think, in Europe we're inspired by park fiction as a kind of action in space to protect from urban development, social, systemic development. We were really impressed by the Danish arts workshops here because Chicago has nothing like it. And we talked a little bit about empowering citizens to act in space. These are from Sherry Arnstein's from the American Planning Institute. They are these like diagrams about how to think about power relationships, delegated authority, total authority, manipulation. Like, where are you on the bracket as an institution? It's interesting to think about it as a kind of mirror, as Apparatus 22 suggested. I like the dirty mirror, by the way. And then maybe just because Tunney's established the terms community and society, community being, face-to-face engagement with people you know, and society being a more abstract concept of law and commerce. These two things are always in tension. And so we're thinking about where we are in these kind of mental, philosophical, social action spaces. Are we in this overlap somewhere between interpersonal space and systemic and structural space? Are they mutually exclusive? Are they more like two templates on human life, and we kind of constantly refer to different parts of that? And is that where our tensions come from? Not to mention ecological and environmental and other kinds of wars and events right now that we're missing. A lot of chaos in the world. And so, is our role like about balancing distributions, mechanical metaphor, the hand in the machine, tweaking the apparatus? Is it about institutional support, foundation support, municipal support? Unlike Europe, the National Endowment for the Arts, which was the government-funded big institution, sort of like your Ministry of Culture, kind of got annihilated by Ronald Reagan, and we have more of like a venture capital model of art practice. It's a little different. I think for us, we're really interested because of that in eliminating the root causes of charity. So Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed factors in. And just to quote Fahim, who says, we're like a table where everybody eats, and we're horizontal. Maybe this is what we are. We're not the poet, we're not the pleasure center. We're kind of the framework that people can plug into in a horizontal way. We're someone from an institution who needs to build a new audience, someone from a community who is interested in showcasing art that's happening but is not being recognized due to kind of structural considerations of who is approved to display in a museum and who isn't, or who is seen, or who has the capacity to be seen. Putting all of those things together at the table where everyone is equal, everyone contributes, and everyone is fed. So it is a mutual aid and pleasure society, in a way, a dining table. And because I have a background in architecture, I really like Aldo Rossi's notion of the apparatus. He talks about apparecchiare la tavola, meaning to set the table. You can set the table, it's kind of a structure, it has aesthetic qualities, but you can't necessarily control the conversation that unfolds. But you can kind of guide it or shape it institutionally. And so what we've been doing is diagramming our work. So one of the things this is the CTA project, one of the things about setting the table, the way we set the table, is new guests show up, some guests have to leave early, the project changes as people plug in. So these are retroactive because if we tried to do this kind of, design planning thing in advance, it would just be a nightmare. So this is retroactively just seeing what we did. A lot of it is conversations and interactions and negotiations. But you're looking at artists, space, intersections between institutions and the CTA, and a necklace of sites that we activated. It's a lot. We recently completed an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago called A Line for Every House. This would be the normal kind of relationship between the curator, us, preparators, electricians, the security. But we found in their records, in their history, they had this art sales and rental gallery. You could take a painting home and hang it in your house in the 60s, usually for wealthy people. But we thought we could determine that because it's already in their history, so we thought we could use what's in their history and say, well, this is already you, just do it again in a different way. So we invited people who are caretakers for communities in the city of Chicago. that's how the art rental would work. You could pay a little bit of money, and some people, when they became wealthy, would donate like a gym nut or something back to the collection. But instead, we asked 10 hosts to house art in their house. We negotiated with the curators and the estates of the people, and there was conversations directly between the curatorial team at the Art Institute and the homeowners to decide on different kinds of art they would like. So it was like this whole conversation that unfolded, which is videoed. Then we invited photographers to come and photograph the art in the house, or whatever they deemed to be home. Some people picked a landscape. And they were in conversation with the hosts. Then the hosts, audiences, all the constituents in 10 different sites around the city of Chicago, and all the photographers' audiences, our audiences, and the museum's own marketing system, all of those people showed up to the opening. So Avery likes to say we were in the church basement, actually, because it was the local show to the Art Institute of Chicago. At the time, Bogh was upstairs, and they opened they resurrected the Egyptian show. We had the largest audience turnout for any show ever in the photography department of the Art Institute of Chicago in all of its history, and we were second during the run, just behind Bogh, but above the Egyptian release. And I don't think it's anything necessarily special. It's just that when you network, it comes with a lot of audiences, and all those audiences have an investment.
But it is special. It is special. It is special. They put you downstairs for a reason, right? We from the museums. You downstairs for a reason, and then when you do something downstairs that only happens upstairs, that shows you that the value is not just what's upstairs, right? That's why it's special.
And there are the usual negotiations, like with the electricians and security systems, because we're plugging into the building's infrastructure that wasn't quite equipped for what our loads were and other things. But and then there were this documentation of the conversations between curators and hosts about the work that they wanted to exhibit. Items from the collection in association with the show. And we proposed, if you know the Art Institute has two lions on either side, kind of Roman allusion guarding the building. The show is called Lions for Every House. It's derived from a poem about people who protect each other's houses in a community. But this has its own lions. And we presented an idea for a performance on the front steps, which is kind of like a theater. But institutionally, everyone went away for summer vacation, and there was no one to manage it, so it didn't happen. Okay, the Danish Arts Workshop was very inspiring to us. We bought a little building because if you think you're not going to own anything and drift around space, you end up acquiring a lot of tools and materials and equipment. And we realized we were renting little studio spaces and storage units, and the accumulation of all those rents were more expensive than just kind of buying an inexpensive old garage and making it a workshop, which will become a residency space for international residencies, national residencies, and local residencies. And one of the ideas is if you have stereoscopic vision looking at something, we can make a residency program that's networked with Europe, Africa, and other spaces, and think about subjects together that are of common concern but may express themselves differently in different places. I've heard things today about museology. It echoes some of the things we are concerned with, but it's different because your funding streams are different and the nuances are different. And so we already have a network: Floating Museum, Urban Growers Collective, which is a farm, the Hyde Park Art Center, and we're building an international network. So the idea is to pair people up to have conversations as a residency program for Chicago. And that's the borough's house. This was a pavilion we built with the Biennial for Urban Growers Collective, which is now an artist's residency space. So there's a network already when you arrive of things to plug into. And then really, at the end, through this residency, museum-wide, we got to think about if we were to work with museums here or elsewhere, how would we think about how to deturn or think about the institute, hallucinate the institutional structure a little differently. Sometimes institutions, they have an abstract thing, but we take them as concrete, but we made them and we can alter them. So these are kind of, at the top, actions in the history of the museum, sort of like an art sales and rental gallery, and the acquisition of objects. When you run an exhibition today of objects from the 15th century, it's an action in the present. So it's kind of like Janus looking forward, projecting forward and backward at the same time. And this is just taking stock of potentials within institutions. They're incomplete, they're just kind of sketches. We were thinking about chiasma too. We got some information from Sarah. This pink fence controversy was really intriguing to us. And just to close, I think this is our experience. That institutions, especially in Chicago, tend to center value and objects, but forget that those objects are valuable because somebody created them. And it tends to erase that contribution. I know a lot of you today, I'm listening to your talks, expressed maybe tension or anxiety, but I would just say from our perspective in Chicago, even though you feel like you're behind, in some ways I think you're ahead of some American institutions because you are openly expressing your tension and anxieties around what an institution, how it should behave, and we commiserate, and it was really helpful. And, we're really glad to be here. It was really helpful to hear how you're thinking about things. We learned a lot of things from you that will help us not sabotage our own institutional development. So thank you very much.
So look, before we go, I'm always saying you leave people with something to remember, right? Okay. So let's do this one more time. We real cool. We just doing the moves. We love school. We lurk late. We go. We strike straight. We sing sin. We dance gin. We jazz June. We die so. And poets snap their fingers when it says, "What is that cool?" Have a wonderful evening, y'all. Thank you.